Okay, today we are starting Siman Tzadi which is all about special halachos for Davar Charif. The word Charif is, we roughly translate that as something that's sharp, and some of the common foods that are Davar Charif are onions and garlic and radishes. More about both of those things later as we go on, but that's just some basics. And today it's going to be just an introduction and an overview of the topic of Davar Charif, and then in the future, we're going to talk about more specific applications. The more specific applications, excuse me, that are here in Siman Tzadi Vav. So there's two main Gemaros that speak about Davar Charif. One is a Gemara in Shulchan, and it's a Gemara that's right after the din of Nat Bar Nat, which we talked about in the past, which was Siman Tzadi Hey. And the Gemara says like this: the Gemara says, "Dagim shal bakar mutar lacham bekutach." That's the din of Nat Bar Nat. If you have fish that's put onto a hot plate, a fleishig hot plate, you can eat them with milchiks. Even though the plate was fleishigs and gives time into the fish can be eaten with milchiks. That's fine. You're allowed to do that because of Nat Bar Nat. That's what the Gemara said. Right afterwards, the Gemara says, you have a radish and you cut it with a knife that had been used for fleishigs. So it seems like a very similar case. One was fish that had been fish that was put onto a fleishig plate, and here it was a radish that was put on something had contact with a fleishig knife. There, the dinner says, "Asalachim b'kutach." You can't eat it with this dairy food, with kutach. Why? And the Gemara says, "V'hani milu tznoin." This is a special din for tznoin. The agav chorfe bale, since tznoin is charf. Therefore it's boileah. Okay, so it taught us that teaches us two different things. First of all is that there's no heat. There was no heat over here. Just cut it. Not like in the first case where there was heat. Here you just cut the radish, and even so there's time transfers anyhow. Okay, that's one of the dinim here in Siman Tzadi Vav. Davar Charif has a special din of called duchud the sakina. That if you cut something with a knife and it's charif, then it has a time transfers even though there's no heat, and we will talk about the details of that din of the sakina in the future. Okay. The second din is that even though it seemingly be not bar nat, just like in the case of the fish, a second before the Gemara right before him said that not bar nat makes it that it's not fleishig. You can eat it with milk, with cheese, with kutach. I'm sorry, but here you cannot. Here you also lachum b'kutach. Okay, that's the din of not bar nat, which we spoke about in the past. That the din of not bar nat, that if it's Davar Charif, the din of not bar nat does not apply. Okay, so that's one Gemara. That's a Gemara in Chulchan. The other Gemara is a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, and the Gemara is like this: there's a certain food called a karet shel chiltis that the Mishnah had said that you're not allowed to buy it from Goyim, and the reason is because like that. The Gemara says the masikli b'sakina, because we're concerned that the guy called off this karet shel chiltis, this karet with a non-kosher knife. So the Gemara is like, well, who cares? So what if you cut off with a non-kosher knife? We say, why don't we say Stam came in Ibn Yayman, and it's not Nam of Gam, so why shouldn't it be mutter because of that reason? So the Gemara says, Agav Chorfet the Chiltisa, since the Chiltis is Charif, therefore, it makes the shamnunis, the grease, I mean the fleishigs that's involved, or the treif, the meat that's in the knife or on the knife, whichever shot it is, it's mechayile. It makes it pleasant. Rashi uses says what it sweetens it. In the mosque, it makes it sweet, makes it pleasant again. So even though the time we should say Neshnam of Kam, it should be Eini ben Yomer, and it should be Mutter. No, since it's Charif, therefore it makes it takes away the fact that it's Pogum. But Havli can listen Tam Mashach Wasser, and it makes it as if the treif time is as if it's positive instead of being Lefkam, because it's Eini ben Yomer. No, in this case it's like it's positive. Okay, so the first thing is the Gemara tells us again this rule that time can transfer from the knife to the karet, even though they're not hot. They're both, in ambient temperature. Time transfers anyhow. That's similar to the Gemara had said in Chulin. But here it's adding an extra point that even though the knife is Eini ben Yomer, since the chiltus is charv, somehow it overpowers or reverses the pegima and makes it, even though it's Eini ben Yomer, it becomes l'shvach again. Now, this din of chiltas, this case of a chiltas that does this didn't call being mechayil l'shvach, it actually doesn't say it in Siman Tzadi Vav. That case of chiltas is not here. There's actually a Chuvas Rajba who says that chiltas is such an unusual plant that you don't have to. That's why it's like not mentioned in certain things. But other possible applications of this din of B'chayil Shrach from a Davar Charif are going to be in Sim Tzadivav, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about in a different time, which is that application, that other major application of the din of Charif, that's B'chayil Shrach. It takes a Blia, that's Lefgam, and makes it to be somehow L'Shrach. Okay, now, each of these Gemaros was about a specific vegetable. The first Gemara I mentioned, L'chum, was about a tznoin, and then this Gemara about Zara is about a chiltis. And some Rishonim, in each of the cases, some Rishonim hold that these dinim are specific to that vegetable. I mean, the din of that there's no nap or not is only by tznoin. And some hold the din of Mechayel Yisrach is only by chiltis. That's what some hold. But others say that no. Last is the Gemara. In each case, the Gemara says that the fact that it's charif is the reason for why the din happened. So it happened to have picked an example of a chiltis or tznoin, but really would apply to any vegetable that's charif. The Gemara says that in each one case, the Gemara said the reason is because it's charif. So the din is really for any kind of charif has that din, and we're going to see when we talk again the din of Duchel Zakin and Mechayel Shrach. We'll see how the Mechaber and the other place can talk about it. Which of these Rishonim they hold like on these shadows. Okay, so we will continue on for today, assuming that these dinim apply to any Davar Charif. Okay, now, so I told you that there's 3 halachos of Davar Charif that you see from these Gemaros. There's a din of Duchel Sakina, that cutting makes time transfer, if it's a Davar Charif, that there's no nap or not, and that it's Mechayel Shrach. Okay, those are 3 dinim that we saw from these Gemaros, and those in the nap or not we had in Siman Tzadi, and the other 2 dinim are going to be here in Siman Tzadi. Aside from that, I'll mention very briefly, there's 3 other dinim that have to do with a food being Davar Charif, having to do with time transferring and things like that. I'll mention them. We'll talk to them. We will, talk about them way in the future. The first is that the din is that if there's a Davar Charif in a Kli Sheni, it's hot, and it's a Davar Charif in a Kli Sheni, it transfers as if it was in a Kli Rishon. In Mitzvah Hashem, we'll talk about that in Siman Kuf Hey. Okay. Another thing is also in Siman Kuf Hey is that usually Kavosh takes 24 hours for time to transfer. But the din is that for tzir, or brine, like a very salty mixture, it happens in just a few minutes. The share given is 6 to 18 minutes. It doesn't take 24 hours. It's really quick, a couple of minutes. And there's different shittas about whether Davar Charif also has that property that it transfers, that time transfers really quickly for Davar Charif also. Right? That also, in Mr. we'll talk about in Siman Kuf Hey. And last is that depending on if the situation is right, and you have kosher and non-kosher food cooking in the same oven, in the same chamber at the same time, under the right circumstances, so little time transfers that it's just considered like a fragrance. We call it reicha. Just a reicha transfers between one and the other. So lechatchila, you're not allowed to cook them together, but the Yevid, under the right circumstances, it'll be mutter. We say time does not transfer from one to the other, but if it's charif, then time does transfer. Okay, Mitzvah Hashem, when we get to Siman Kuf Ches, we'll talk about over there with that case. Okay? So, I told you there are 6 dinim that I'm telling you that have to do with that are dinim by not of Davar Charif. Not per not, Duchel Sakina, Mechayel Shrach, Kli Sheni, Kavosh, and Reicha. Okay? And it's just interesting to note that 5 of those 6 dinim seem to be based on the same idea. That is, a Davar Charif can get time out more completely and more effectively than heat does. What I mean to say is like this. Time comes out so completely that it doesn't degrade to make that not bar not come into effect. Not bar not means because you didn't get the whole thing. You get less and less each time it transfers. So no, Davar Charif gets it all the way out. And Reicha is also doesn't get just a little bit of time. It gets the whole time, or enough time transfers across that it makes it also. Similarly, Davar Charif gets time out really quickly, or really easily. So like it gets out with Duchel Sakina without heat, or in a Kli Sheni, which usually time doesn't transfer with the Yevid. And maybe, according to some, mixed Kavosh happens quickly also. So all these 5 of the 6 din that I mentioned to you, all seem to have the same idea. The fact that it's charif make time come out more completely and more effectively than it would have with heat, and therefore there's all these different examples or ways that we see that feature of a Davar Charif coming out. But the one that sort of doesn't fit in all those six is the din of machayil l'shvach. Seemingly, however it works, it sort of seems to have nothing to do with Tam coming out more completely or more effectively. Like it seems to be totally like a random din. That's sort of like a coincidence that it happens like that. Now, we're used to seeing them together because Simon Tzadivav is where the Shulchan Aruch brings all these din, two of these din together from two very different Gemaros. But the question is it just a coincidence? Are these 6 dinim, is it 5 are from because of one reason, and the 6th thing, which is also for Charav, it comes from a totally left field? Or is it maybe some kind of a connection, and somehow the reason why Mechayil L'Shach also has to do with the same reasons why Davar Charif has all these other properties? Well, so when we get to talk about Mechayil L'Shach, that din of Mechayil L'Shach, we'll see, we're going to talk about there of exactly how does it operate, how does it work that it's Mechayil L'Shach, it makes it back into something that was nice round of gum, all of a sudden magically becomes L'Shach. So when we talk about that, we'll see if maybe we can find a reason, a way to understand how the Mechayil L'Shach is really connected to all the other dinim of Davar Charif. Okay, now what we're going to talk about is what's Charif? How do we know, or what does it even mean that something is or is not Charif? Okay, we mentioned some of the applications of a Davar Charif, but what food is a Davar Charif? We saw 2 cases in the Gemara, which are radishes and chiltas. The chiltas is for your whatever I mentioned in passing with asafatida. We talked about it when we learned about alcoholic beverages. There's a certain very strong tasting grass that grows. Now, I said to you beforehand that the word charif is roughly translated as sharp. Okay, but the truth is that word is not really the most descriptive way of saying, describing what the word charif is. It seems like that the word charif is any food that's sufficiently sour or acidic. Those are actually the same thing. Sour, acidic, bitter, sharp, or very salty or spicy. You will see from all the examples we're going to talk about later that all those things are included in what's considered charif. Okay, those are descriptions of the taste. We could say the same thing in a different words, which is to say, differently to describe how the effect it has on a person is foods that are caustic or mordant or biting or harsh. All foods that have those properties are considered charif, and I found the word that maybe describes it best is acerbic. Okay, if food is acerbic is maybe the most concise way to describe what it means charif, but it really that includes all these things that I mentioned. Okay, so sharp is just like one very type of food. In English, the more descriptive words than just the word charif, and it seems that all of them are included. Okay, before we continue on with what charif is, we have more to say about that. I'll just mention a few points. One is that there's the Pri Megadim brings from a Chuvas Panim Iris that there are no such thing as liquids that are charif. Okay, he says this to answer up a Gemara, say Pshat in the Gemara Pesachim. The Gemara says nothing about Davar Charif at all, nothing to do at all with Davar Charif. He just reacts that, and nor does the Panim Iris give any explanation for why would it be true. I mean, we see Charif properties to all kinds of liquids, so he doesn't explain how it should be, why it should be, and the Gemara makes this is his own explanation, not with any basis in the Gemara, so to speak. And Dr. Tshuva, when he brings it, he says he doesn't agree with this Panim Iris, doesn't agree with it. And on our own, we're going to see that lots of places we'll talk about whether borscht is actually the case that the Panim Iris is speaking about, and the Dr. Tshuva, borscht and lemon juice and vinegar and whiskey, we're going to see in a few minutes, all those things, there's either they are charif, or there's at least discussion in Pesachim about whether they're charif or not, and those are all liquids, and no one turns around and says, no, it's not charif because it's a liquid. So they all don't, it doesn't seem like anybody really agrees with this idea that liquids are automatically excluded. Liquids could or cannot be, depending on how they taste. That's one thing. Another thing is, it's interesting, it's just I don't know how meaningful this is, but science believes that there are 5 tastes that we taste with our tongues, and the rest of taste, or what we call taste, is really fragrance or odor that we detect from our noses or the back of our throats. And those 5 tastes that we detect with our tongue itself, 3 of them are salty, sour, and bitter, and those are really like the backbone of what we call charv. Of course, if they're strong enough, those things are actually what makes up charv. And there's one other one, which is spicy or sharp, which science doesn't consider to be technically a flavor. It's more, they call that a pain. It's detected by pain receptors, and those pain receptors are in the mouth also. It's not officially considered a taste. But so all these things that we have, salty, sour, bitter, and spicy, or sharp, are all things that we detect in our mouth, as opposed to other tastes which are more subtle, or different kinds of taste that we taste with our tongue. Okay, the other two with our tongues are sweet and umami, and those are not included in charv. I'm not sure if this means anything, but anyhow, let's go on. Now, so I told you these different ways to describe that the word charv means a little bit broader than the word sharp. Has these other meanings as well. Okay, now, at the same time, it's very hard to give rules of what food has enough acerbity to qualify as charv. Like, for example, the Gemaros says, a case that we have of our Gemara was the case of chiltis. Okay, a different Gemara in a totally different context says that chiltis is so acidic that if an animal eats it, it makes him into a treifa. It makes it'll make holes in their intestines. That's how acidic it is. It'll make holes in their intestines and make the animal a treifa. So most parts obviously don't assume you could be charv without that. You don't need to be so like exactly like a chiltis to be charv. Chiltis is like an extreme example of that. Okay, and on the other hand, at the same time, again, I'm trying to talk about how hard it is to pinpoint what exactly is charv. Is the other Gemara says that Tznaim is charv. Okay? Well, the place is going to talk about which Tznaim, which radish are we talking about? Are we talking about like the regular radish that we're used to? I mean, like we have with the red skin on it. Is that the radish they're talking about? Did they only mean there's a very pungent radish which has a black skin on it? Maybe that's the only one that's charv, and maybe the red one that's not charv. Or other people say the opposite and say not only is the regular one charv, but even the one that has the white skin on it, what we call a daikon, even though the white skin, that's also charv. That's much milder than either of those two are. So that means to say is, should bring up the point that here the Gemara said Tznaim is charv, but we have three choices of what the word Tznaim even means. Okay, so again, it's very hard to put our finger on. It's usually what is exactly charv, especially to put that in writing. Okay, another thing is that a name, when we say a name, sometimes the name itself is not descriptive. Like one example is just the Tznaim, like I just told you. Tznaim, just three different choices of what the word Tznaim means. Another is, the Machaber says that sour fruit, peres chamutzim, or dagam luchim, salted fish, are considered charv. Okay? Now those terms are somewhat vague. Well, what's peres chamutzim and what's dagam luchim? And all kinds of things about it. Like for example, Granny Smith apples are kind of tart apples, but those are not tart. Those are not sour enough to be considered peres chamutzim. They're sour, but tart. But tart is a very mild form of being sour. But how about on the other hand, crab apples? Those probably are sour enough to be considered. That probably is what the Machaber is looking at peres chamutzim. But the word peres chamutzim is vague. Which one did he mean? Okay, well the Chasmas Adam says that when it says Dagam Meluchim, it only means herring. Herring is so salty. That's what the Machaber is talking about when he said Dagam Meluchim, but not other fish. And not everybody agrees with that. Not everybody agrees with that it's only talking about herring. Okay, so that tells us another weakness. And even when we say something, this thing Dagam Meluchim is, but the word Dagam Meluchim is somewhat vague. And, lastly, is we understand by ourselves, sort of intuitively, we understand that. If a davar charif is a tiny ingredient in a big food, that doesn't make the whole food charif. Like if we put black pepper and salt, we'll see later, black pepper and salt are both considered charif. No problem. But that means if there's a pinch of salt or a drop of black pepper in the food, we understand that doesn't make the whole food charif. Just because there's a drop of salt, there's salt in basically almost every food. So that doesn't make it charif. And the Rama actually says that in order to be charv, it's only considered charv if roiv of the food is made from the charv component. Okay, that's what the Rama says. It has to be roiv of the food is made from it. I mean, to exclude the tiny pinches. Okay, so like for example, if we have mayonnaise, Okay, so mayonnaise has lemon juice or vinegar inside of it, it's a common ingredient, and both of those count as charif. But nobody thinks that mayonnaise is charif because it's a small percentage of the mixture is the Davar Charif. So of course that's not considered charif. But on the other hand, the Ramaz, when he says it has to be roiv, he's only giving us a very basic, minimal, sort of a rough guideline. Because, for example, if something would be 40% black pepper, the thing would be so strong and so sharp that no way that anybody can eat that food. Of course it would be hard. Okay? And sometimes the opposite. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes we have a food, the person we speak about, we have he's talking about borscht that I mentioned before, an alcoholic borscht, which some people consider charb. And he says if you add a little egg to lighten it, to lighten the color, makes it not as dark red, it makes it a little lighter. So then that makes it, that's his words are mamtik tam hacharifas. It softens the taste also, mellows the taste also, and becomes not hard. Okay, so sometimes a little bit can make a difference. Okay, and from a different angle, let's talk about if you cook or you fry davar charif, then it makes it mellows the taste to the point that it's not considered charif. And so really, in the end of the day is really we have a lot of direction from poskim about food. They talk about them, and we see descriptions of what is or is not charif. But l'chayr, in the end of the day is the way we decide whether the food is charif is someone's got to put it into their mouth and taste it, and either it tastes charif or not. With Messiah, of course, of what they've seen and what they read and what they heard from their rebbeim of what is charif or not. But in the end of the day is what's decided. I mean, the Pri doesn't even say such a thing. He says, "I'll call if you always any hamayra." That what you have to sort of see it out for yourself and say, is this charif or is it not charif? Okay. Now, before we go on, I'll mention a question, and that is, if we had to decide if a food is charif, let's say onions or vinegar, we have to decide if they're charif or not. So the person making that decision, the person who's making that decision, has experience with onions and vinegar, and he knows either he thinks they're charif or they're not charif. Okay, so in this case we're going to say both of them are considered charif, and he knows the onions are charif because he's tasted onions, and he knows onions are charif. Okay, what happens if we have something happen to the davar charif, and now we're not sure if it's still charif? Like the onions were cooked a little bit, so were they cooked enough to make them to lose the charifas or not? Or the vinegar was turned into a dressing. Well, was the vinegar mixed with enough things that it's not charif, or was it not? So what are you supposed to do in that case? How are you going to decide whether the food is charif or it's not charif? So on the one hand, we'll see in Siman Tzaddik Ches that the Ramah says that nowadays we consider ourselves not bikiyim and we can't decide things based on our taste. We're not sensitive enough to notice taste and to make such nuanced differences between it has a tam of basar or it doesn't have a basar. Yeah, we can't make such decisions. So we don't do things based on that depend on taste. And it even talks about it. The Shach even says that you can't if you want to know if the tam from a knife came to the davar charif, was it Bitul or was it not Bitul? You can't taste the food to see did the tam of meat from the knife get into the davar charif or not, because we're not keen to know that. On the other hand, there are some cases where we are samich on te'ima. The Rama says in the case of you want to know if an animal is missing its maror, its gallbladder, so you could taste the liver, and you could see if you taste the bitter taste of the maror. Or you want to know that the Navidul Taima was mixed into foods, and you think it might have been not even nice in time, even though it's an Navidul Taima. So there also, the Shach says you could be samich on te'ima. Now, in each of those cases, there's reasons to be miracle, but maybe that tells us that sometimes we can be samich on it. And actually, a reason to think that maybe we can be samich on tasting it is because the whole point of a davar charif is that it has a really strong, powerful taste. So maybe for that, everybody's bikiyim. What do you mean? If you didn't notice it, if it's such a subtle taste that you couldn't notice it, then guess what? It's not charif. Charif means it's going to be strong and obvious, and everyone's going to be able to taste it. Different than the case I told you beforehand, that the Shach said. The case I told you beforehand, that the person wants to taste if the meat went into a Davar Charif. There he's looking for the subtle taste of the meat. But if you want to taste, is this thing Charif itself? So that's a pretty obvious thing. Okay, so one last guideline that's helpful in many situations is something that Pri Megadim and Yad Yehuda bring from a sefer called Beis Hillel in Simon Tzadi, and that says like this. He says, if the food is such a strong, biting taste that the food is not edible as is, you have to eat it with something else. You can't eat it by itself. That food is carved. One of his examples is vinegar. That people eat vinegar mixed with other things, like they make it into dressings, and we use vinegar with other foods. But most people would not drink a cup of vinegar as is. And therefore, that tells us that's why vinegar is considered Davar Charif, because it's not something that's edible as is. We can only eat it with other foods. So, like for example, we can understand also that herring is considered to be Charif, or salted herring is considered to be Charif, because people always eat it with like a cracker. You can't eat it straight; it's too strong, and therefore, this salted herring would be Charif. But other fish that are just salted, that's not enough. That's strong enough to be Charif. Okay, that part of the Beis Hillel is a little more straightforward. If we come across something that has such a strong taste that you can't eat it by itself, you have to eat it with other foods, that's not considered Charif. Now, the Beis Hillel also says the opposite. He says that if the food is edible as is, then that's a sign that it's not Charif. Okay? I'm not sure that the other person agreed to that second half of the statement. Okay? And one reason to think like that, to think that maybe not everybody agrees to that is, we'll see in a minute, that the Magen Avraham says that whiskey is considered Davar Charif. So, whiskey is something that people drink. They drink it as is. So, is that it's not clear to me. Is that the opposite of what the Beis Hillel said, that if something is edible as is, that makes it not Charif? Seemingly, he's saying, if whiskey is Charif, then it's edible. Okay? On the other hand, I'm not even sure that the Beis Hillel meant it as a rule. I have to say to you, I'm not even sure the Beis Hillel meant it as a rule. In the specific case he was talking about, different strengths of alcoholic bars, he was saying you could judge that by whether it's edible or not edible. I'm not sure if he even himself meant it to be a rule for everything that you look at. Okay, now, the reason I think that maybe whiskey is not a proof against Beis Hillel, so to speak, is because the Lamaisa is that people, even though people drink whiskey, it's really uncommon for people to drink like a whole cup of it. They sip at it. They drink a shot glass of it. But most people, unless they've really been drinking for years and they've really gotten themselves used to it, won't drink it. So maybe that's enough considered that you don't drink it as is. You just sip at it is different than drinking the food as is. Okay, anyhow like this. Now I'm just going to mention a number of examples that the place can speak about. Foods that are reasonably common. I didn't pick the really unusual foods that are reasonably common, and that most of the poskim, it seems, in each of these cases, consider them to be Charif. They're going to be Cholkim in every one of these, I think, just about. But give or take, there's somewhat of a consensus that they're Charif. I'm going to do them on my paper. They're in alphabetical order, so I'm going to do them in alphabetical order, even if that's not the most common way to look at them. Okay? So I've mentioned already fish, like particularly herring, salted herring, somehow people talked about. Garlic is the Mechaber brings down. That's considered to be Charif. Ginger is in the Ramah. Mishmur talks about it also, that ginger is considered to be Charif. Horseradish is also in the Ramah, and the Mishmur brings it as well, that it's considered to be Charif. We're going to have later in the Mechaber, in Halacha Daled, that lemons and lemon juice are considered to be Charif. Just as an aside, the Magen Avraham says esrogim are also Charif. I guess they're pretty similar. So lemons and lemon juice are Charif. Okay, the Darkei Tshuva brings, and as is the Mishnah Berurah, say that olives are Charif. It comes from it's based on a din in Hilchos Pesach about cutting olives, Taf Mem Zayin, and based on that they say that olives are Charif. But the Mishnah Berurah and others give all kinds of rules about exactly which stage of processing and pickling the olives are considered to be Charif. It's not automatic that the olive is Charif. It depends on all kinds of details about when the olive is or is not Charif. Okay. Next is onions. That's also the Mechaber brings down an example of a fruit that's considered charif. I'm assuming that scallions, which are green onions, what they call green onions, are also charif. I can't say for sure. I suspect that they are also. But what's not as clear to me is what about like sweet onions, like Vidalia onions and shallots, whether those are considered to be charvos, because those have a milder taste. That's why they call it sweet onions. Okay, next is peppercorns. Back to Machaber in Kof Gimel. It's also brought here, specifically here in Sim Tzadi, in the Shach and Tzadi Vav, but also it's part of spices, okay, which is in Shulchan Aruch, that spices are considered to be charv. But peppercorns specifically I mentioned. A lot of places in Daki Chuvas we got pickles, that they should be considered charv. And as I said beforehand, there's a wide range of what this word means. So the word pickles, it means pickled cucumbers. I bet there's a lot of different types. I'm not convinced that all of them are charv. Okay, radishes I already mentioned, and the Machaber brings it. It's basically the Gemara. Excuse me. And we talked about that there's 3 different types of radishes. Not clear which ones are included. The Shach brings that salt is considered to be charv, and I mentioned the Machaber says spices. And when we say the word spices, this word charv, that means things like pepper or chilies. That's probably what it means. It probably does not mean mild spices like paprika. Okay. Then vinegar. Vinegar is brought in the Ramah. It's brought in the Shachi and our Simon and other places. The Mishbur himself brings it also. And we're going to speak more about vinegar when we get to the din of Machayil Shvach, where there's a lot of details about that, about whether it's charaf or not. And last, what I've mentioned already before, which is that whiskey, the Magen Avraham says that whiskey is considered to be charaf. Okay, now, for what it's worth, there's a bunch of foods that are mentioned in the Gemara or the Poskim that I thought it was worthwhile to just say what they are, because it's hard to sometimes to know what these things are. So the word for ginger in Yiddish is zangvil. Okay, for those who care. I mentioned already, but chiltas, I'm doing this again in alphabetical order. And challah is vinegar. Okay, we know all those things. Now, there's another food which is lefes, or the Gemara calls it lifsa. The Shulchan Aruch calls it lefes, but in the Gemara it's called lifsa. That's a Gemara. The Gemara in Chulun, which talks about Davar Charif, mentions that lifsa, and it says that it's not charif. Okay, to the point, it's so not charif that if you cut a lefes with a knife, then afterwards the dinim of Davar Charif don't apply to that knife anymore. There's no duchas sakin anymore because all the time has been taken out of it. That's how powerful this lefes is, how not charif it is. Okay, now the Shach says that lefes is in German is a word called Ruben, which is a German word for turnips and beets. Okay, turnips and beets have the same word in German, is Ruben. Okay, and Rav Kapach in the Mishnah, is in the beginning of Klayim, the Rambam says that the translation of the word lefes is the letters he uses are Aleph, Lamed, Pei, Saf. Okay, it sure sounds like lefes, but it's actually pronounced alaftu, which is an Arabic word for turnips. Okay, so turnips have a drop of a bitter taste to it, but we can understand that turnips and beets are not strong enough to be considered to be charif. Okay, now, after I just told you that the Gemara says that lefes is not charif, lefes is so not charif that it undoes it sort of kasher, so to speak, the knife to make it that you can then cut charif afterwards. And that's brought in Mechaber in Simon Hay, in Sif Hay. And all of a sudden you look in the Pischei Tshuva, in the Simon, and he brings a sefer in Mekam Shmuel, who talks about whether beets are charif. Okay? Now he uses the word roite Reuben, okay, which means red Reuben, which of course is talking about the beets, which are red, as opposed to the turnips, who are white. Anyhow, he says roite Reuben. Okay? And the Pischei Tshuva, when he brings it, he says, the Yiddish word for this roite Reuben is borkish, which is the Yiddish word for beets. So you're a little surprising at first as you see this thing, and it says he's talking about whether lefes and roite Reuben, he uses both words. The roite Reuben are beets, but the Gemara says that they're not. Okay, so if you look at it more carefully in the Mekam Shmuel, and the Daki Tshuva makes this point, he's not talking about beets as is. He's talking about fermented beets, and it's the fermentation that makes it that they might be considered to be charv, but beets by themselves are not to be charv. Okay. Now, I'm going to mention some of these other things in a second, but I'm just going to mention that in modern Hebrew, changed around a lot of the words that I'm about to mention, lefes being one of them. So I'm just going to tell you what the modern Hebrew is, which is not only not necessarily, but not what the real translation in Mishnayos and in Poskim means like this. So in modern Hebrew, turnips are lefes. That's fair we know. But beets got a new name called selach. We'll see in a second that selach is something like beets, but it's not beets. And Swiss chard is called mangold. You'll hear where that comes from in a second. That's a Yiddish word. That's another word. No, that's really what that selach is. And then they also took the word tered and they made that into spinach. Okay, so now let's go on. So now the Gemara also says, talks about silka or tardin. Okay, and that's brought in. It's in Gemara Chulin. It's also brought in Mechaber in Sif Aleph, and they talk about it being Duchot Sakin and Davar Charif. Okay, so those things about that silka has that din. Now, in Klayim, in that same Mishnah, those same Mishnah at the beginning of Klayim, it talks about a food called tardin, okay, and the Rav over there says that that tardin is the same thing as silka. Okay, and the Shach here in Simon Tzadikov also says that tardin and silka are the same thing. Okay, but the Rav adds that silka is an Arabic word. So tardin is I guess more Hebrew version, and silka or salak is the more Arabic word, and that's the Arabic word, which is al-salaku. Okay, so salak, that's al-salaku. Okay, I obviously didn't pronounce that right, but I tried. Anyhow, so that's what salak is. And Rashi also says that silk and tardin are the same thing. I'll tell you more about Rashi in a second. Okay, so what is that? So now we know that salak and tardin are the same thing. I told you that in modern Hebrew, tered means spinach, but that's no shaykhs. That's not what it means. So Rav Kapach tells us in the Mishnah, when he's talking about translating, when he's translating tered, he says it means sikla, which is what we call Swiss chard, and that in the Tver Yisrael in the Mishnah also says that tardin is mangold. That's a Yiddish word for Swiss chard, and it's also Swiss chard, and it's also English, another way we call it in English. So Swiss chard / mangold is what this food is, this salak or tered. And I told you in modern Hebrew, Swiss chard is now called mangold, okay, which is from this Yiddish word from the Tver Yisrael. Okay, so now Swiss chard is a leafy vegetable, which is it's a variation of beets, whereas beets get their redness and everything goes into the root part, which is what we eat. Over here, the root is not so edible, and instead it goes into the leaf, and the leaf has this reddish, a lot of redness to it, and it's actually a little bit of bitter as well. Okay, I told you it's known as radish, and I guess that is about it. Okay, in other times, we will talk about the specific dinim of Duchot Sakina and Mechayel Shvach and how they apply.